that greatest hits compilation of Jewish food that we've put together around a few times a year when American Jews remember, oh yeah, these are the foods we ate in a decontextualized way. The foods that made it onto that menu, those are the foods that people remember fondly. And chopped liver is the one that got its way, whether it's Shabbat or whether it is Hanukkah or it's just for Passover in the ways that it's served. And either it made its way to the holiday menu or it's made its way to the deli menu. And so if it didn't make it to either of those two repositories of Jewish gastronomic memory, it's basically lost. And that's sort of the reality of American Jewish food.
Welcome to 18 Jewish Foods, Culture and History in kosher bite-sized portions. This podcast tells the stories of iconic Jewish dishes, shedding light on the people who eat them. Here's your host, Joel Haber.
What is this episode's topic? Chopped liver? Actually, yes it is. Chopped liver is an interesting food. People who love it are really passionate about it. When I post anything or write anything about chopped liver, it always generates the most responses. Recently, I published an article about chopped liver on the Nasher, actually an article that was related to this podcast episode, so I encourage you to check it out. But in response to that, I actually had people reaching out to me via email directly that almost never happens from other articles I've written. At the same time, those who strongly dislike chopped liver are equally passionate in their hate. It is a highly polarizing food. In the article that I wrote, I did discuss that unique aspect of chopped liver and what makes it so different from so many other foods. So I'm not going to be focusing on that in this episode. Here, I want to focus on the history and the significance of this dish. So chopped liver belongs to a category of foods known as offal. Offal, or also known as variety meats, are the organ meats of an animal, or other odd bits like feet, cheeks, tongue, and tail. In the episode I did about Me'orav Yerushalmi, I did discuss the idea of Bal Tashchit, of not wasting. I also focused on that deeper in the Kashkarikas episodes, so I encourage you to listen to those. But I want to explore frugal foods in general here and go a little bit deeper on the idea of not wasting. People often say, oh, well, we just ate what we had, that we were poor and we just made use of anything that was available. And the idea of poverty food does play a role in Jewish cuisine. But I would also point out, first of all, that it is not unique to us. In Italy, there's a class of foods that is typically referred to as cucina povera, the food of poverty. And many cultures around the world made use of whatever they had when they were poor. We are not unique in this attitude towards food. But certainly, for much of history, many segments of the Jewish population were particularly impoverished, and therefore this was not a defining element, but a significant element in our culture. However, I also want to point out that this is often overstated. People assume that everywhere in history all Jews were poor, and this is not at all the case. Certainly, there were some segments of the population everywhere and always that were extremely poor. And at the same time, there were also definitely plenty of wealthy people, even in places that we consider purely impoverished, like Eastern Europe. But most of the people were somewhere in the middle. Not the wealthiest, not the poorest, but able to survive. And yet this idea of frugality did play a role even in the cuisines of that big middle. Chopped liver, I believe, is a great example of this. In its origins, it seems to have been the byproduct of something else rather than the initial target food. Most trace the roots of chopped liver back to foie gras in Alsace, France. The Jews there, historically and even still today, specialized in the practice of fattening geese. This was actually an old Roman technique. It was not invented in France. And most likely it was Jews who arrived with the Romans in Gaul, what later became France, who probably preserved that method. And the reason they did it was not necessarily because they enjoyed fattening geese. It was because they needed to create more schmaltz, the fat that would be rendered after the goose was slaughtered. This was the preferred cooking medium in that region. There were no olives growing there, so they didn't have olive oil. There weren't many other oils. The non-Jews would use lard, pig fat, so we needed fat to cook with and used geese. Presumably, once they had started doing this process and discovered that the livers were larger and tasted good, they began to sell them to non-Jews in the area because it was valuable and they didn't necessarily need every single part. And the non-Jews are the ones who turned it into the famous pâté de foie gras that is a French delicacy. Chopped liver can be made with goose liver. It can also be made with calf's liver. Nowadays, chicken is the most common. But there are still differences between chopped liver, even if made with goose liver, and the classic foie gras. One is that because there is so much blood in the liver organ and it pretty much permeates the liver, for kosher purposes, the liver must be actually broiled first. And so there's going to be an inherently different texture in a kosher chopped liver from a classic foie gras, which typically would be cooked at a lower temperature. Jewish chopped liver also typically includes sautéed onions, and onions are a classic Jewish ingredient. I don't mean that only Jews eat them, but throughout history and around the world, Jews have been lovers of the alliums, onions, garlic, leek, etc. Definitely, onions are a very important ingredient in Jewish cooking. Now, often chopped liver will also have hard-boiled egg cut up into it. This may have been a technique for stretching it so that the dish would feed more people. It also would change the texture and perhaps improve it, the result of having a tougher liver after broiling it. And normally it would include some of that schmaltz, the rendered poultry fat that was actually the original purpose of fattening the geese. The overall desire for Jews to eat organ meat may not only be due to its flavor. In fact, chopped liver, for many, most of the people who don't like it, it's because of its flavor. It has a decidedly minerally kind of taste to it. But more, it was the desire to eat anything that was edible in an animal. In a chicken, in particular, there really aren't any other large organs. Hearts might sometimes be eaten on their own, but most of the other organ meats are very small and typically would just be combined and eaten together, maybe in a soup, maybe filling a sausage of some kind, or maybe just mixed, chopped, and sautéed. In general, these are sold together as giblets or packaged together as giblets with the chicken or goose that you buy. Liver is one of the only ones that was large enough to become its own dish. And so that probably contributes to the prominence of chopped liver as an Ashkenazi Jewish food. Looking more closely at the place of chopped liver in Ashkenazi cuisine, I turn to Jeffrey Yoskowitz. He's one of the most knowledgeable people I know on Eastern European Jewish cuisine, and along with Liz Alpern, he runs Gefilteria, a gourmet Ashkenazi food company, and they also together wrote the cookbook, The Gefilte Manifesto. In your research and a lot of your work, you focused a lot of attention on Ashkenazi Jewish food. And I want to start by asking you if you can describe maybe some of the significance of chopped liver within the canon of Ashkenazi cuisine.
Wow, yeah. Chopped liver plays a huge role in Ashkenazi cuisine, in a very different way now than it did years ago back in the old world, back in the old country. Now, it's never the most appetizing or the most exciting of the offerings. The history of chopped liver is completely different. Chopped liver was one of the most celebrated foods of Eastern Europe and, frankly, of Western Europe. I mean, you think about foie gras in French cuisine, and, many people actually credit foie gras and the tradition of fattening geese, as problematic as it is, to the Jews of the Alsatian region, because they frankly were fattening geese up for schmaltz, for goose fat, which is the most amazing fat if you haven't cooked with it. It really is an acquired taste. And I think a lot of these smellier, more pungent food traditions that were not quite American, that reflected or revealed an immigrant past, those foods didn't make it in America the way that a lot of others did.
To those who love chopped liver, it's a delicacy, but in its origins, it was largely a food that was designed because we could eat it and you want to use everything that you have.
There also was a tax. There was a tax on kosher meats in various different European countries, and offal and these discarded other meats and those were exempt from that tax. And so if there's anything that the Jews love in history, it's finding the loophole and getting around things, right? So an extra love of liver for that reason. Now everything got flipped coming to the New World, right? Everything got flipped for a number of reasons, but you see community trying to adapt to the reality of dense urban living, to go from living in a small shtetl or a town. Not everyone lived in a small town, but there you had a tree, you had a patch of land, you had availability of foods. Likely you had a few geese, you had some chicken. Like these were things that were possible. Now you move to tenements on the Lower East Side, and Jane Ziegelman writes so well about this in her book 97 Orchard. But you're lucky to have a shoot of grass, a blade of grass coming out of the ground. I mean, families did try in the late 1900s to raise geese in the backyards of tenements unsuccessfully, but they tried.
So lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about some of the other frugal foods within the Ashkenazi culture. I think we can probably start with your signature of gefilte fish.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking of that as being in that list, but oh my gosh, yeah.
I mean, the idea of stretching the fish, no?
Yeah. I mean, to me, gefilte fish is like, as much as people love to hate on it, it's like still one of the most beloved and like central parts of, Ashkenazi food and tradition in so many ways. But yeah, I mean,
you certainly know more about gefilte fish than I do. My understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, was that there was a big element of adding in a starch to stretch it, so that if this fish, when it was whole, could feed 3 people, now it can feed 6 people.
Yeah, that's always something I learned and heard growing up. It's also just a culinary technique. So it's kind of funny where the line is, a lot of the explanations, I think, with a lot of Jewish foods and other food traditions, of course, it's about stretching, but it's also about binding, right? Sometimes it's about binding foods together, and sometimes it's about adding more flavor, or adding matzah meal, or adding flour, or adding a potato also adds texture and dimension to it too.
Maybe we'll just, to end, we'll rattle off just a few other frugal foods from the Ashkenazi palate and how they were frugal.
One of them is, I think of eierlach or eggies. I'm not sure if you know these, that they're like the little
the unformed eggs that were in the chicken when they slaughtered it.
Exactly. And then those are served in soup.
I've never had them because I don't know where one can find them anymore. I don't even know if most of the health codes allow them, but have you had them?
I have not. They're also illegal. They don't meet health safety codes. But you can find them, and they are available in New York in Chinatown. And the next one I have on my list, which is chicken feet, is another Chinatown crossover. And of course, chicken feet were huge for making. A lot of people would tell me, "Wait, you're in my cookbook. You have a chicken soup without chicken feet? That's not Ashkenazi." Like, right. And not only was it for flavor, it's for all the collagen of the chicken feet. I mean, we always talk about, the next one on my list is pacha, right? The boiled cabbage foot to make the jelly, which is kind of like the Russian holodets, a gelatinous meat product. This is something that texturally, savory gelatin product was just lost here in America. It's just not something that is common. I mean, I would say it's like a more celebrated stinky food is herring, and that's something that is still, I think, a proving ground, just like chopped liver is, frankly, for like young folks to when you get to sit at the adult tables, when you start to appreciate these more complex, stinky foods. They weren't the holiday foods. I think that's just the important piece to this. And as you ate as an American throughout the week, come holiday, come Shabbat, you suddenly that's when you expressed your Jewishness, right? Come Passover is when you really took it seriously. Now, interestingly, liver made it to the holidays. Herring was used both every day. It was an everyday food, but also we've kind of migrated it over to the holidays. Gefilte fish, certainly holidays. I'd say the chicken feet and the eggies, that was a chicken soup, which was in some cases every day, but also definitely holiday now too. So that greatest hits compilation of Jewish food that we've put together around a few times a year, when American Jews remember, oh, yeah, these are the foods we ate in a decontextualized way. The foods that made it onto that menu, those are the foods that people remember fondly. And chopped liver is the one that got its way, whether it's Shabbat or whether it is Hanukkah or it's just for Passover in the ways that it's served. And either it made its way to the holiday menu or it's made its way to the deli menu. And so if it didn't make it to either of those two repositories of Jewish gastronomic memory, it's basically lost. And that's sort of the reality of American Jewish food.
Now, chopped liver is just one of many Jewish offal dishes. Throughout North African and Middle Eastern Jewry, for example, many organs were stuffed, such as tripe, spleen, and intestines. Sometimes the filling of those stuffed organs would include other organs, such as chopped up lung. Lung and kishka would be Eastern European versions of these organ dishes. Lungen or lingen was lung that was stewed, and kishka would be the intestines, but there where it was typically more impoverished than in North Africa, it was stuffed basically just with a flour and schmaltz and onion combination. Lamb or calves' feet, which were made into pcha in Eastern Europe, became a popular soup in Yemen and also in Kurdistan. And there is a particularly Persian version of a Shabbat stew that included feet, tripe, tongue, beans, and spices. And so that was a uniquely Persian Shabbat stew that had lots of offal in it. Now, frugal foods go beyond just organ meats. A number of the ones I'm about to discuss I mentioned in passing in other episodes. But one way of being frugal is to repurpose leftovers. So the shamburak that I discussed at the end of the Me'orav Yerushalmi episode is one example of that. But so are knishes, so beloved in Ashkenazi cuisine, where leftovers are encased in a dough of some kind and then baked, and you could just take it with you. Some refer to it as an edible Tupperware. Bread in my house growing up, old stale bread would be turned into croutons or maybe French toast. But a classic Sephardic dish is boyos de pan, where it is turned almost into a bread pudding and fried in small balls. Another frugal technique is stretching the food. We mentioned this in the interview dealing with gefilte fish, but from Sephardic cuisine, albondigas, which I believe I spoke about with Helen Jawara Pinier in the Adafina episode, is another food like that, where rather than just making little meatballs, the chopped meat is mixed with vegetables that are mashed up. And this is a way of stretching that protein. And a third technique for being frugal when it comes to Jewish foods is simply using inexpensive ingredients. Romanian Jews love mamaliga. This is not unique to the Romanian Jews, but having a porridge of corn, a polenta type of a dish, but eating it in many different forms is one of the classic ways of having an inexpensive food. And from Russia, you have kasha, which didn't necessarily mean buckwheat, as most of us know today. It meant just a grain porridge, a mush. Brisket is an interesting one because today brisket is rather expensive when you try to buy it in the markets, at least in America. But classically, it was a less desirable cut of meat. It was poor meat, and it's a tough meat. That's why it was not so expensive. But we figured out how to make it taste good with a long, slow cooking and braising process. All of these are different frugal foods that grow out of Jewish tradition. Sometimes it's the techniques of cooking. Sometimes it's the focus on the ingredients. But since this episode does have some overlap in its subject with others, all about frugality and ways of saving money, I wanted to stress that Jewish food is not just about saving and about eating cheaply. That certainly plays a role historically. But there are many other aspects, things like eating elaborately and fancy foods, and or focusing on symbolism and religious significance. This latter aspect is something that I will touch on in my next episode, where my guest will be Shuli Madnick, and we will be discussing Malida. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Got any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at jewishfoodbook@gmail.com. Please listen, like, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and I would truly appreciate it if you'd share this with other Jewish food lovers. The theme music you hear is Adir Hu Revisited by Rebbe Soul. Check him out wherever you stream music. And as always, until next time, I wish you B'tei Avon.